All right, everybody, how are we doing today? Welcome to our Bible study today. I hope that, and those of you that are online, we want to welcome you. Do y'all know that today we had our community-wide prayer breakfast, and we used to call it the Mayor's Prayer Breakfast. Jeff Williams started the prayer breakfast, and now we have a group of pastors who now oversee it. Our Engage Arlington Pastors Group, and we had over 400 people this morning at the Levitt outside at 7 a.m. for the breakfast. But our kitchen staff prepared the breakfast. They've been here since 3 o'clock this morning, and so can we tell them thank y'all? So Warren, I see Warren back there. Warren, thank you, because not only did they do that, they have made lunch for y'all, and then tonight, our young family ministry is going to be in here for First Family Fellowship, so they're making supper for them. And so what if we tell them tomorrow, don't come in till about 7 o'clock in the morning tomorrow morning. You don't have to be here. Don't have to be here at 3 o'clock tomorrow morning. But so grateful for this team. Our worship team also led the worship this morning at the prayer breakfast for our city. They'll be here late tonight rehearsing for Good Friday and Easter Sunday. And right now, they are all just very proud of a pastor who volunteers them for community service. And so, anyway, I'm grateful for what they've done for us. But with that said, today, let's continue our journey. Y'all are enjoying plagues and lunches, it seems to me like, and so we'll just continue that journey today. We are in chapter 8. We're going to look at verse 16 is where we will start. And let me just remind you, as we have there on your outline, that God's deliverance of His people will include these signs and plagues. There are actually two different words in Hebrew. The word that's translated plague means to strike a blow. And it's a very harsh word in Hebrew, and it's used a couple times in this text, in the story of all the plagues unfolding in front of us. But we know each one of them are actually demonstrations of God's power, and they're evidence of God's preeminence over the various gods of the Egyptians. So, with that said, let's look at the plague as the NIV translates it, the plague of gnats. So look at verse 16. Of Exodus 8. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the ground throughout the land of Egypt, and the dust will become gnats." They did this, and when Aaron stretched out his hand with the staff and struck the dust of the ground, gnats came on people and animals. All the dust throughout the land of Egypt became gnats. But when the magicians tried to produce gnats by their secret arts, they could not. Since the gnats were on people and animals everywhere, the magicians said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not listen, just as the Lord said. So, you'll notice I put on your outline below the gnat line. So the next plague after the frogs was the invasion of, it could have been lice, it could have been mosquitoes, just that particular word in Hebrew. Trying to put it into English, a lot of modern translations just use the word gnats. I told y'all that when I was a kid growing up, my daddy was the youngest child in his family, and he was the 13th kid in his family. And there were no twins. My grandmother was 48. My grandfather was 54 when Daddy was born. And she had a child every other year for 26 years. So they all fell in succession. And so Daddy was the baby in his family, and he's from Georgia. He's from Griffin, Georgia. And then later, my daddy's brother and he married my mama and my mama's sister. So two brothers married two sisters. You can do that where we're from, so don't judge us. But anyway, when the war broke out, Daddy was blind in one eye, and so he got drafted, and the Army wouldn't take him, and he tried to sign up for various military service, and nobody would take him. Because what they told him was, if you lose your good eye in battle, then you put everybody else's life. It's not just you, it's that you will put everybody else's life at stake. So, U.S. Steel in Birmingham sent out a plea for men to come to Birmingham to work at the plant because they were building planes and tanks and, Jeeps. They needed the metal from U.S. Steel. So Daddy and his brother and my mother and her sister, they left Georgia and moved to Birmingham to help out with the war, and that's how our family got to Alabama. But my daddy's family pretty much all stayed in Georgia. One of the brothers owned a dairy farm in Sandersville, Georgia, which is just below the Gnat line. Now, if y'all don't know what the Gnat line is in Georgia, you ain't ever been there in the summer. But there's a fall line in Georgia that runs from Columbus all the way through Augusta. And it is the difference between the coastal plain of Georgia and the Piedmont part of the state. And the soil changes on the south side of that line. It's a lot sandier, and the gnats breed in that sand. And so in Georgia in the summertime, there's a difference between living below the gnat line and above the gnat line. If you live below the gnat line, the gnats are way more prominent, and they have all kinds of things they do. But anyway, so occasionally we would go. A couple times, I remember in particular, we went to Sandersville to my daddy's brother's dairy farm in the dead of summer. Below the gnat line on a dairy farm. Are y'all with me? Let's just say that it was a favorite spot for the gnats. It was a little challenging for us. So, you think about Egypt. Here's what the Lord says to Moses. It's kind of interesting because if you remember back in Genesis 2, verse 7, God's going to use the dust of the ground to form humanity and perform a miracle, obviously. Here, he's going to use the dust of the ground all over Egypt, and it will become a swarm of gnats that affect the Egyptians and their animals. And y'all, if you've ever been around that, you know that gnats cause all kind of problems for animals. They get all in their nostrils. They cause all kind of disease. It's a very, it's a nuisance, if not anything else. And what I can remember in those days is the screen doors. I don't know if any of y'all are old enough to remember screen doors, but the screen doors at my uncle's dairy farm would be covered with gnats, during that time. It's kind of interesting. Well, Egypt's covered with them. And here's what's fascinating. If you'll look at verse 18. When the magicians tried to replicate this, they were unable to do it. So for the first time, you'll see I put that in your outline, the magicians could not replicate in any way this form of the miracle, in any form rather. And isn't it interesting what they told Pharaoh? Well, we're not sure what the Egyptians thought about Aaron and Moses. In other words, did they think that Aaron and Moses were magicians like them? In other words, were they just maybe at a greater degree, but they were able to do stuff, we tried to mimic them. And they come to Pharaoh and they say, this is not really the work of magic arts. This is just not something we know how to do. And by implication, they seem to be saying this is not something Moses and Aaron know how to do. In other words, we're just wanting you to know this is something divine that we don't know anything about. And so I like that phrase, this must be the finger of God. What an interesting way to put it. But the point is, it was an incredible nuisance for them. But I want you to notice the end of verse 19. Even though this all happened, Pharaoh's heart is still hard, and he is not going to listen. Now, God has already warned them about this, but that's just where we continue to be with Pharaoh. And again, it's more of a nuisance as much as it is anything at this point. Now, we have no idea. Here's what we're not told, and it's kind of interesting the way the story unfolds. We're not told did Moses and Aaron rid the land of gnats? How long did it last? What was the response to it? We don't know. We just know that sometime later we have another plague. So let's look at that one. Look at verse 20. Then the Lord said to Moses, get up early in the morning and confront Pharaoh as he goes to the river, and say to him, this is what the Lord says. let my people go so that they may worship me. If you do not let my people go, I will send swarms of flies on you and your officials, on your people, and into your houses. The houses of the Egyptians will be full of flies. Even the ground will be covered with them. But on that day I will deal differently with the land of Goshen, where my people live. No swarms of flies will be there, so that you will know that I, the Lord, am in this land. I will make a distinction between my people and your people, and this sign will occur tomorrow. And the Lord did this. Dense swarms of flies poured into Pharaoh's palace and into the houses of his officials throughout Egypt. The land was ruined by the flies. Then Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Go, sacrifice to your God here in our land." In other words, here in Egypt. But Moses said that would not be right. The sacrifices that we offer to the Lord our God will be detestable to the Egyptians. And if we offer sacrifices that are detestable in their eyes, will they not stone us? We must take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God as he commands us. Pharaoh said, "Well, I'll let you to go offer sacrifices to the Lord your God in the wilderness, but you must not go very far." And then a very interesting statement. "Now pray for me." Moses answered, "As soon as I leave you, I'll pray to the Lord, and tomorrow the flies will leave Pharaoh and his officials and his people. Only let Pharaoh be sure that he does not act deceitfully again by not letting the people go to offer sacrifices to the Lord." Then Moses left Pharaoh and prayed to the Lord, and the Lord did what Moses asked. The flies left Pharaoh and his officials and his people. Not a fly remained. But this time also Pharaoh hardened his heart and would not let the people go. So we're calling that section the Lord of the Flies. That's obviously original to me. I came up with that. Who knows, it may take off. So here's what's interesting. I don't know about y'all, but occasionally in the summer, we'll get ready to go to bed, and you'll lay down in the bed, and there will just be one fly just buzzing. I can't take it. I just can't take it. I will get up, turn on the light. I will do whatever I can do to find the fly. I don't even have to kill the fly. I just need to drive it out of our bedroom. I can't be with it. Particularly y'all's flies. You know, in Texas, y'all have these big flies. And, you know, and just, I can't hardly take it. Can you imagine if you're just incredibly overrun with flies? And so that's what's happened here. And here's what's interesting about this particular plague. I want you to notice when you go back, starting in verse 20, there's no staff. God doesn't tell Aaron, throw your staff down, hold it up in the air. There's just no instruction about the staff. That's kind of the first time that we encounter this where God just says, I'm just going to do this. Then I want you to notice that God also miraculously protects the land of Goshen where the Jews lived. There are no flies there. The Lord says, my people are going to be, I'm going to discriminate between you and Pharaoh's people and my people. And that'll just prove it to you. So if any of your Egyptians wander into the land of Goshen, what you're going to notice is there are no flies there. They're going to be completely protected from you. Now, does that mean the Lord did that every time? Presumably is what we think, but here it is stated specifically. And then something else, it says, the land was ruined. So now what's beginning to happen is the plagues are kind of on an order here. Carolyn, I think you mentioned something about that one time. Now we've gone beyond a nuisance. Now it's starting to get destructive. In other words, the land that they used to grow their crops, is being ruined by all these flies. And so now we're moving beyond just the nuisance, of some of the things that have been experienced. Now we're getting to the point to where things are actually destructive. And so it doesn't surprise me then that Pharaoh takes a personal interest this time, and he even starts saying things like, okay, let's negotiate what we might could do here, because this has had an effect on Pharaoh. He's seeing the destructive nature of it happening throughout the land. So here's his concession, which I think is quite interesting. He says, I'm gonna let you go ahead and make your sacrifices. Go ahead and do whatever you want to do, but you need to just stay here and do that. Now, the implication seems to be that the Jews had not been doing that. And so Moses says, here's the problem with that. If we start offering up the animals that we use in sacrifices, that's going to be detestable to the Egyptians. Because to the Egyptians, bulls, cows were sacred to them. The bull was connected to the god Apis, and the cow, the god Isis, and also rams, the god Ammon. In other words, there's a whole listing of gods and goddesses that were animals that you could only kill for meat. You could not just randomly, indiscriminately damage them, and you certainly couldn't sacrifice them. There were specific restrictions about it. In fact, we even have evidence that there were some people, when their armies marched against the Egyptians, they would lead them with animals that they knew were sacred to the Egyptians, almost like a buffer, so that they could start making headway. So Moses said, if we start doing this, and not only that, the Egyptians had a very strong prejudice against people that shepherded sheep and goats. They saw them as rural, agrarian people who were not as cultured as they were. And so they refused to raise sheep and goats. That was something that mountain people or wilderness people did. And so they already had that prejudice. So Moses is saying, if we act like Jews and we start offering up sacrifices that we're required to make, all that's going to do is make it worse for us here. It's already bad enough. Well, they'll stone us. They will react so much against us. So we're not going to do this. So then Pharaoh says, okay, well then I'm going to let you go. You just can't go very far. And so Moses again he's going to turn down Pharaoh's concessions and just say, we're not going to do that. And he uses, remember we talked about this already. There's this idiom that we believe that operated in this Eastern culture where you would state something and then know that you intended way more than what you stated. So when he said, let us have our 3-day journey, Pharaoh understood full well that meant they would be leaving. And so he's just not going to allow that to happen. Moses is going to refuse any kind of compromise. And then it's interesting to me that Pharaoh asks Moses and Aaron, pray for me. So what's happening to Pharaoh is he's noticing his magicians can't do the things that Moses and Aaron are doing. His magicians are telling him this must be an act of God, or a God, if you will. And so Pharaoh seems to be buying into that view, and now he asks Moses and Aaron to pray for him. Now, I want to just share a word with you all about the plagues, kind of in general. Whenever you're studying commentaries, you're trying to read all of this and just study what really happened, you have all kinds of explanations for these plagues. You have people that have just done a whole lot of research, and some of them like to just explain these things away naturally. You know, this happened during this season of the year, and then it's obvious frogs would be the result of that, and then there would be gnats and maggots because you got a bunch of dead frogs, and flies would follow that. In other words, there's all these naturalistic explanations that maybe God just used some of these natural events and somehow that was a part of the story. Well, I understand that kind of research, but here's what I would tell you. The challenge is there are just some things that stand out in the story to me that demonstrate that the plagues are actually miracles of God. So, just in some research, I came across this. Joseph Free's written this book called Archaeology and Bible History, and a number of authors quote him because he's the one that kind of came up with this rationale for saying that these were actually miracles. So let's just look at those. The first reason he gives is the intensification. The Egyptians rather, they were acquainted with seasons of the year where there were frogs and insects and those kinds of things, hail, darkness. But what's happening in these stories is there's an intensification beyond anything Egypt will have ever experienced. That's why it gets their attention. They've just never seen anything like it. That's why you hear these magicians saying, this must be the finger of God. We've never seen anything like this. We've had, locusts and frogs, and we've had all kinds of things, but we've never had anything on this scale. So that's the first thing he points out. And then second, the predictive nature of the plagues. Moses could say, tomorrow the flies are going to show up, okay? Or we'll get rid of the frogs tomorrow. And so there's this ability to predict when things are going to happen and how they're going to be removed. And when it happens, they're removed. And so what the Lord seems to be doing is demonstrating his power over creation. And it could be, y'all, this is as much for Israel as it is for the Egyptians. Because this is reminding Israel that their God, Yahweh, is Lord over creation. He can do these kinds of things because creation belongs to Him. He brought it all into existence. As a matter of fact, there's one group of scholars that has taken the entire story of the plagues and tried to go back and match it to the creation story. And what they do is they use similar vocabulary, or they've discovered similar vocabulary that's used in the creation story in Genesis 1 and 2 that's also used in the account of the plagues. In fact, one theologian who's done that, he calls the plagues God's act of uncreation. In other words, God created everything, and then He just showed you just how much power He had over it. He could undo it and allow it to be used as forces of judgment. But the point is that there's a predictive nature to these events that demonstrate we're pointing to God and not to some type of natural explanation. And then the discrimination, which we read about today, and we're going to see that happen again. God's going to judge the Egyptians, but He's going to act discriminately by protecting the Israelites. So this is not going to happen to them. So there's this boundary idea, if you will, that's built around the miracles themselves so that the Egyptians are experiencing them full brunt, Israelites not. And then the orderliness, the plagues now, as you start looking at them, many scholars group them in groups of 3. But if you begin to notice, particularly today, we're moving beyond nuisance to destruction. The land was ruined. In other words, there are ramifications now that are going to last beyond the plague. It's not just the plague of the flies. Now what's happened is it has challenged the Egyptians' ability to plant their own crops and provide for themselves. So the reverberating effect of the plagues is beginning to unfold, and it's beginning to get worse. And so there seems to be somewhat of a progression that will culminate, obviously, in the final act of judgment, which will be the angel of death. But the one I would also point y'all to that I think is maybe the most important one is that these plagues have a moral purpose to them. They're not just accidental or coincidental occurrences. That's not what's happening. These are intentional expressions of the power of God. And what God is doing is He's dismantling this pantheon of gods and goddesses of the Egyptians. He's undoing their worldview because their entire worldview was built around this pantheon of gods and goddesses. And just like most people in the ancient world, somehow it was tied to the governing of their people. In other words, not only did they have this array of gods and goddesses, they elevated their leader to the point of being a god, and they basically believed that he was the one who could manage all this for them. And he was the one who would protect them in all of this. And it's a fascinating study of the ancient world's understanding of governance, their superstition, and their religion. You know, it's interesting to me when you look at where we are today. There's been a lot of research that has been done through the years trying to understand the impact that Christianity has actually had on the history of the world. And it's fascinating research. Y'all know that I'm an amateur historian, and so I love to study history and the philosophy of history. But there is a prevailing theory among many people, and it's not really just a theory, it's just a perspective, I think, rooted in reality, that Christianity has had such an impact on the history of the world that it's really hard to talk about the progression of the history of the world without telling the story of Christianity. Here's a great case in point. What's going to happen with the Jews, who were much smaller in their influence in the world, in the ancient world? What's going to happen with the monotheism of the Jews? It's going to get baptized by Christianity. So Christianity is going to be the full flower, if you will, of Judaism. And it's going to spread beyond ethnic Judaism, and it's going to permeate the ancient world, and Gentiles throughout the Greek and Roman world are going to be converted to Christianity. And when they do, their understanding, their worldview, their understanding of just pick any topic is going to be completely different than what dominated the pagan world. And so ideas like removing the belief that nature itself is divine and separating your understanding of divinity from nature. The idea that you can remove the concept of divinity from your governance. In other words, that you no longer look at the people who rule over you as divine. You separate that out. In other words, and not only that, you have this belief in Christianity of a rational God, of a God who's actually created something that makes sense. And the whole development of rational thought, and put that in the field of any educational academic discipline you want to put it into, whether it's philosophy or science or medicine, all of that is connected to and predicated on an understanding of a rational God who's created a universe and stands behind it and over it and underneath it and around it, that it works. And then Christianity spreads across the world. And so guess what happens? You have things like universities and hospitals and care facilities and governing structures and understandings about governance, to where you begin to remove the divine from all of that and you see it for what it really is and you worship the God that stands behind it. Now, here we are in 2024. We still have people who live like the ancients lived. So, for example, are y'all still with me? So, for example, if we were to go to North Korea, and if you were to interview people in North Korea, many of them believe that their ruler is a god. And he completely governs their life, and everything is dependent upon that one family. Now, we're in 2024, and that view is still there. And what you and I need to understand is that's the prevailing view of the ancient world. It's an anomaly to us. It was the view of the ancient world. And so think about how Judaism lives in the midst of that environment and begins to grow, at least in one small part of the world, if you will. And then when Christianity is birthed, Christianity pervades the entire world. And so these views of governance and separation of divinity and an understanding of creation, rational thought being woven into the fabric of creation in the universe, all those are Christian principles. These are not ancient world principles. This was not the philosophical or religious worldview of the ancient world. Christianity stands in huge contrast. It's in relief to all of that. It truly has changed the history of the world. We take it all for granted today, and there are derivatives of it now and tentacles of it that are found all over the world that no longer seemingly have a connection to Christianity. But I say all that to say to y'all that the resurrection of Jesus that we're going to celebrate Sunday literally changed the world. It just changed everything. And it's really hard to exaggerate the impact Christianity has had on the development of civilization. And so this right here, to me, is an evidence. This is the incipient side of it. This is where Moses is God's working through Moses and Aaron to show these Egyptians your worldview and the prevailing worldview of everybody around you is wrong. The Pharaoh is not a god, and he does not govern creation. I govern creation. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to methodically undo all of this right in front of you. And as he's undoing that, he's building a theology for Israel right alongside it. So he's destroying one worldview and constructing another one at the same time. That's why this is going to take a little while. It's not going to just work out, after one thing. So the hardening of Pharaoh's heart contributes to this. It leads to greater judgment. But what's going on is there's a moral purpose underneath it all. And I think as we study the book of Exodus, we have to understand that's what's happening in front of us. It's a narrative where a theology is being built through the narrative, if you will. And it is going to undergird what's going to occur many, many years later, because Jesus is going to take much of this imagery from the book of Exodus and apply it to his messiahship. So that's one of the reasons that we're studying Exodus this year, is to help us better understand what God really did then, what God did through Christ, and what he's continued to do in the world. So with all that said, it's fascinating. Pharaoh remains unconvinced. You got frogs, you got water, you got gnats, you got flies, and he's still not ready. Well, that's because the divine purpose of God is not accomplished yet. And so they're working right alongside in tandem with one another, okay? All right, I'm going to stop right there. Thank you, online congregation. We will see you next week, and happy Easter to you, okay?